Good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome to this this first in the series of panel discussions to mark the 5th anniversary of Transform ELT's existence, and it's about the 3rd anniversary, I think, of the Transform ELT's Globe Communities of Practice. We've timed this, or we've scheduled this discussion to also to mark International Mother Language Day, which seemed an appropriate time to hold it, though it's something that it's an event that we wanted to hold anyway. So, as Jen says, I'll be monitoring the chat box throughout the discussion, so please don't hesitate to pose your questions. Just before I hand over to Amira, I'd like to mention 2 very relevant events that are coming up shortly. On Friday, the 3rd of March, a British Council hybrid research forum designed to contribute to the project that the British Council is currently engaged in to update David Graddoll's well-known Future of English book, and the new edition, as it were, or the 2nd volume is planned to appear later this year. So I will, before we close, I'll put links to that and the other event, which I'm going to mention, into the chat box so that you can find out more about them and hopefully attend those events. The other event is organised by the Hornby Trust, and it's a 2-day conference on the 11th and 12th of March, completely online, and it's the 2nd Hornby conference on decentring ELT. The first was held in 2021. There's a summary of those proceedings available online, and again, I'll post the link to enable you to register for next month's conference if you're able to do so before the end of this session. So Transform ELT have a very close and special relationship with Africa ELTA, who are our strategic partners, and we've worked with them on various projects in recent years, and it gives me particular pleasure to introduce you to Amira Salama, who is the current president of Africa ELTA, who's going to start proceedings and introduce you to today's speakers. Over to you, Amira.
Thank you very much, Alan, and I'm very excited about this panel discussion, and thank you for inviting all of us to celebrate with you Transform ELT anniversary. This panel discussion, as Alan mentioned, is on today's occasion of celebrating mother tongue language, and on this occasion we thought that we would invite speakers who come from different contexts to share with us their views, research, and also practice about the same topic. So I would like to introduce our 3 speakers today. I'm going to do this very briefly because you would love to spend the time hearing from them rather than hearing from me. I'm going to introduce our first speaker, Adrian Holiday. Adrian is a professor of applied linguistics and intercultural education at Canterbury Christ Church University. His publications deal with the cultural politics of international English language education, the Western ideologies which inhabit our understanding of non-Western cultural realities, and he's going to, I'm sure, enrich our discussion today with his views on the topic. Rosario is coming from Uruguay. She is a former director of the academic department of the Alliance Cultural Uruguay, and she has presented at international conferences, including TIS, Council. She has a great experience in teaching in Uruguay and in non-Western contexts. Our third speaker for the day is Rita Bilmawila, who has a PhD in education, English language teaching from Rhodes University in South Africa. She's currently the publications officer of Africa ELTA and the newsletter editor. And she is going to share with us her views as well, coming from South Africa. So we have a very diverse group of speakers today. To start with, I will start with my first question, and it's on using local pedagogy, since we are talking about using language in the classroom and also using it with our learners. So I would like to hear from our speakers their views on this topic in a world where English is taught in diverse contexts and sometimes in difficult circumstances. How do you see the importance of using local pedagogies, local practices? And I'm sure you have also heard about the arguments of aligning these local pedagogies to the what's usually called world-class standards of teaching. How do you see this relationship? What are your views? You're going to start with Rita Bill first.
Thank you, Amira. My view is that it is very important for us to use the local pedagogies for us to teach English. I watched a video not very long ago of a researcher who was talking about the days when she grew up, how the education she got from school was totally detached from her social life. And she narrates in particular how she was taught how to read the alphabet. A is for apple, and it rings as an adult, that still rings in her mind, how she kept saying A is for apple, and yet she didn't even know what an apple looked like because she was in a context that did not have apples. Apples were something that comes from outside. And so I strongly advocate for the fact that yes, we can teach English. We should teach English. It is, as others call it, the global vernacular. But we need to contextualize it. It needs to speak to our context. And in addition to that, I believe that it is important for the learner's school life or what they learn at school to speak to their real life context. Thank you.
Thank you, Rita Bill. Talking about real life context, Adrian, what are your views on this? You are muted.
I agree with everything that my colleague just said. I think in particular, the connection with social life that the children or the young people or whoever is learning English already have. I'm not so sure exactly what is meant by local, but I would say that whoever is teaching, they need to teach as well as they can in the way that they know how to teach. But the most important principles are they have to connect with existing intelligence, criticality, and linguistic and cultural experience of their students. That is absolutely the prime focus. And I would say that what they must avoid, and this might sound strange, any method with an acronym attached to it, because that means it's been established somewhere else as being world class, and usually it's steeped in some sort of Western view that only Western people know how to teach properly. I have a very small story. I've recently been writing about what happened to me when I was 23 and I first went to Iran to teach with the British Council in 1973, if you could imagine. When I got there, the people who taught me how to teach were Iranian teachers, and they were absolutely brilliant. Suddenly the British Council came along and tried to make everything more efficient. And they flew in British Council teachers from London, and immediately I lost the contact with the place that I was actually teaching in.
That's an interesting story. Thank you, Adrian, for sharing it. We're going to fly now to Uruguay and hear from Rosario about her thoughts on this.
Thank you, Amira. Yes, I agree with what my colleagues have stated. I can add that I have witnessed different methodologies. I have used different methodologies that have an acronym, as Alan was saying, but my teaching philosophy is eclectic. So I try to get what is best from each and what works for the students I'm teaching. And I agree that using local pedagogies is the way to reach the students in a specific context, making those connections with culture and local culture, contrasting maybe. If I want to teach apple and the apple does not exist in my culture, I have to explain what it is, and probably I will try to make a connection with a fruit that is similar in size, maybe, or in taste, I don't know. But this is what I would do. And regarding local pedagogies and world-class standards, I believe it is of utmost importance to have a clear idea of the standards to be achieved by a particular class, a group of students. So we must bear in mind where we are aiming at. We need to share that with students and help them reach standards. And the way to see if they have reached those standards would be to take measurements, okay? And by measurements, I would be referring to evaluation, okay? It could be formative, it could be summative. We can use international measures and see if they whether our tools, our evaluation tools are valid. We can verify our evaluation tools by comparing to international measures, maybe. But all in all, I believe that using local pedagogies would help meet world-class standards.
Thank you, Rosario. And by local pedagogies, I think we mean here the kind of teaching that the teachers develop within their classroom with their particular students, seeing like this works for them, for this group of students. As Adrian mentioned, maybe regardless of the method of teaching, but this is how it works with this type of students in my school in Cameroon or in South Africa, or in a particular context where I teach. This is what we mean by local. Some teachers actually doubt whether this is an effective way of teaching. Listening to like experts talk about different ways of like teaching using methodologies and different pedagogies. What you mentioned, Rosario, is very important about the idea of measuring the learning outcomes. So what advice would you give to teachers who are for using local pedagogies to make sure their teaching also is, or they are doing quality instruction as well? And I will start here maybe with Adrian.
Sorry, what were you asking me again?
I'm sorry, I took you by surprise. Okay, so I was asking, how would you guarantee teachers are doing quality instruction while using local pedagogies?
I've got scribbled down here. You need to be a good teacher, but you know who defines what a good teacher is? And going back to the story I was telling before, at that moment when I was at the British Council in Tehran, when the London teachers arrived, suddenly I became a native speaker. I hadn't been one before that. The invention of this term. And as soon as you have that term, it just gets in the way of everything. So being a good teacher has got nothing to do with being a native speaker or a so-called native speaker. So, you know, I think that's a very, we have to get rid of things that get in the way rather than trying to invent new things that are already there.
Yeah, thank you, Adrian. Rita Bell, would you like to share your thoughts on that?
I agree with him that we should not rely on certain evaluations and say this is right according to this. Yes, I also agree that we do need to assess, we do need to evaluate and see if the pedagogies, these locally developed pedagogies work. My understanding of teaching is that pedagogies, local pedagogies are already assessed. Here is what I'm trying to say. If I'm teaching, if we are looking at the cultural setup, in whatever context you are, assessment is seen in the change towards whatever it is that we were trying to teach. If a parent is raising, I want to make it as simple as possible and look at the home context where there's no test written there. However, the way in which the parent inculcates culture and tradition into the child is assessed by the way in which the child behaves after that. And so even our local pedagogies, we are now in the formal setup, which is the school, we still can import what we consider to be traditional, but we still can assess that and see if it is bringing change. For me, is there any transformation towards whatever it is that we want to reach? That would be our measure of success.
Thank you, Rita Bell. Rosario?
Well, I can add that I firmly believe that we need to measure what students are learning, and we can develop our evaluation tools in the place where we are working, or we can resort to other evaluation tools that are available online. There are plenty of them. And students work towards passing the test many times. But I also believe that the ultimate test is whether students can communicate when faced to the context in which the language we are teaching is taught. So that is what I tell them. Okay, if we are teaching English and you go to a place where English is spoken and you can communicate, you can work, you can study, you can read, then I will consider myself successful in having taught these students. Okay.
Thank you, Rosario, and everyone for your views on this. And as we are celebrating today the Mother Tongue Day, I think it's important for us also to hear your views about using L1 in the classroom, in the English classroom, in multilingual and bilingual contexts. There are still teacher evaluations. I'm talking also, I'm from Egypt, and I see this as well in teacher training contexts, that still there are evaluations for teachers on how much they use Arabic in the classroom or how much they revert to L1 in the classroom. And this is still seen as something that is not really good a teacher would do. So what are your views on using L1 in the classroom, especially in bilingual and multilingual contexts? I will start maybe with, go back to Adrian, yes.
You keep asking me first, so I have to think of something very quickly. I'm interested in what my colleague just said about learning how to communicate. It seems to me that if you know how to communicate in your first or your second or your third or your fifth language, then you should be able to transfer that to how to communicate in English. There are so many people I've encountered who have English as their only language who don't know how to communicate. And I remember years ago in classrooms giving the best marks in terms of communication to the students who had the worst grammar, but they knew how to communicate. So being able to communicate is something you have to bring from your other languages. So this is a competence that doesn't belong to the language you're learning. It's something you must transfer from the other languages that you already have. So you don't learn how to communicate by learning English. You learn how to communicate first, and then you adapt that to your English. So the other languages are extremely important in that respect.
Thank you, Adrian. Rosario?
Thank you. I agree with Adrian, and I can add that it's very difficult to teach students to communicate in the second language in English if they don't know how to communicate in their first language. And one thing that has happened to me, and it happens very often in my contexts, is that students may be taught how to speak in their first language pretty well, but not so much so to write. And so when they take English courses, they work hard on that. And we also know that they lack those strategies in L1. So we capitalize on L2 there. But at the end of the day, what they say is, you know what? Now I know what writing is about. And nobody taught that to me in my first language. So we feel happy that we have contributed to the development of both languages. But going back to your question, in my context, the use of L1 is frequently resorted to as a means to provide clarifications or explanations. And it's particularly tied with cultural issues or linguistic features pertaining to the second language that greatly differ in regards to the local language. And world expressions are borrowed from different cultures, and translanguaging is seen very often these days in our classes. Many teachers favor that. It's also a way of incorporating L1 in the classroom. I would say that the use of L1 is expected and allowed as long as it is carefully employed, especially by instructors. Learners would rather turn to L1 when they feel that you're not able to communicate their ideas, and they feel anxiety. And so that increases the result to the resort to L1. And depending on how crucial the issue is to the lesson being taught, it would be advisable to just clarify or explain the point in L1, or if it is crucial, then to support a student who is struggling with the issue by scaffolding and facilitating what they wish to express, giving the students some keywords that would help them express their ideas. Now, in the case that the use of L1 is practically irrelevant to the lesson, it would just be better to reply in L1, and we would be saving class time or other more pertinent purposes. And of course, there's a difference whether we speak about bilingual or multilingual contexts. In my case, it's a bilingual context, and the teachers generally share students L1, so it's easy to go back and forth. Okay, in a multilingual context, maybe that is a bit harder, but today's technology would provide the support that would help teachers understand their students' queries. There are many apps they can resort to that can be used for the spoken or the written word as well. And a technique that has worked for me is the use of what I call L1 breaks. And sometimes when students engage in arduous discussions and they start to feel frustrated when they feel they cannot make themselves understood, Well, first of all, we need to think, why does this happen? And maybe it's because we as teachers did not provide enough scaffolding for the discussion, or maybe it's that students have strong feelings about the point. But the result is that the discussion is taking longer and leading nowhere. And so in those moments, what I do is I cut the discussion in English, and I would allow a 1 minute L1 break for students to express their ideas in L1, and then I resume back to English. So it's like, you know, they let it off, okay, and they feel easier to go back to English then. So to round up, I would say that the informed and moderate use of L1 favors the learning process.
Thank you, Rosario. And my question is basically about the perceptions, actually, because I see we are talking about L1 use as scholars in research and how important it is to be used in the classroom. But actually, reality is a little bit different. Still, there are perceptions about teachers who use L1 in the classroom as being not really qualified enough. And I heard this here in my context in Egypt. And I'm not sure about your context, but still the prevailing perceptions about using L1 in the classroom are not really in agreement with what we talk about when we talk about its effect on learning. Ritabel, what about the situation in South Africa? Can you tell us about using L1 in the classroom and whether it is really something that is welcomed?
When I was younger, we used to say the L1 interferes with the learning of English. And now we have changed. We now say the L1 influences the learning of English. We now talk of code switching, we now talk of translanguaging, and teachers are now allowed to use, as my colleagues have indicated, to use L1 here and there. However, when you talk about our parents, that the community at large, this code switching practice is not yet fully accepted. They go to an extent of saying, if my child is going to be taught still using the home language, then let me rather take my child to an English medium school, you know, something like that. They desire to hear their children speaking English like a white person. If you, no, I'm black, so I'm trying to explain it that way. They have an expression that says, I want even the accent to sound, and so on. And so they are worried that when you keep explaining concepts in the local language, then the child might not master it. However, gradually, those who are more enlightened, who are more exposed, are gradually accepting that idea.
Interesting. Thank you for sharing your views on this. And as you might know, the theme of this panel is decentring English teaching. So I'd like to ask our speakers about their views on decentring English teaching. How can we do this as classroom teachers and professionals in the field? And I will start maybe with Ritabel this time.
To decenter, in my opinion, is to shift English from its position of power, not to totally remove it, because we all acknowledge the fact that it has become the global language. However, we want it to share space with other languages, not to be the dominant language. That's my understanding of the concept of decentering English. And I'm an advocate of that. I fully support the idea that we can use the other languages. If we are to win this battle of decentering English, we need to be brave enough to allow other languages to come into the stage, and also to allow dialects of English to be born along the way. Because as we speak English, you can hear my accent is not an accent of one who is a native speaker. Those are some of the issues that we have around the issue of decentering. There's an understanding that if we are going to say this is the proper language, it must be spoken even with the native speaker's accent. But we need to be brave enough to say, no, it's still English, even if it is spoken by someone who's not a native speaker with an accent and with other dialects and so on.
Thank you, Ritabel. Rosario?
I agree with Bretteville, and I know this has taken many years to shift from one very centered way teaching English to allow other, let's say, views into the teaching of English. But leaving generalizations aside, many times we can see there's a tendency for people to look at the world around them from their own perspective, okay, and interpret only what they think they see. But on the contrary, I think decentering promotes understanding, each other by considering their own worldviews and experiences. So in theory, it's logical and it may be doable, but in practice, of course, it's very difficult. But I guess that we must insist, we must be brave enough, as Rotterdam said, to incorporate and allow this this combination and this world Englishes as into our own teaching as well, okay? And I guess that it is vital to respond to the questions we get, but by making use of other questions that can shed light on the real query we are getting, okay? So in simpler terms, we should not take things for granted and make sure we understand what the real question is when we receive it, okay? And Retabile mentioned even dialects, and yes, even idioms and collocations may differ from one culture to the other. So we need to understand what it means in context, okay? And but I guess that this approach enhances the learning process and foster collaborations among teachers, among students, because it helps explore different views and it promotes researching topics from different angles. And from the teacher's perspective, when dealing with classroom observation, we are precisely, I guess, decentering teaching because we are sharing different views, especially if we are working across cultures and when observing teachers. So I guess that it is something we are it's becoming a lot more accepted these days, and we should keep fostering that position.
Thank you, Rosario. Adrian?
It might be easy for me to say this because my entire career has been built on the status of the native speaker. But I think the only way to decenter is to remove completely from our language this concept of native speaker. And you know, my first colleague shouldn't need to make any reference to whether she's a native speaker or not. It's very difficult because, as we know, and as she said earlier, so many parents want their children to sound like some idealized thing that they've heard about, which, you know, has very little basis in real life. Very recently, I was unlucky enough to spend quite a number of hours in hospital in the outpatients department. I was okay. I was feeling okay, but I was waiting for tests and so on. I was surrounded by people with a multiple variety of different Englishes. What I had to do was make myself stop trying to imagine which ones were the native speakers and which ones weren't, which is very difficult to do. But as soon as I managed to do that, it was amazing what I began to hear and understand of what was going on around me. It was all to do with how well people communicated with each other in very, very difficult circumstances. There were people there with different skin colors, different shapes, different looks, and so on. There's no way I could even imagine, are they British? Are they not British? I would have no way of knowing whether they've spoken English from birth or not. And it didn't matter, because what it all came down to is how they communicated with each other. And the man sitting next to me, who I sort of imagine was born and brought up in Britain, his English was so different to mine that it was easier for me to communicate with someone else who probably had arrived in Britain 2 years before. This native speaker concept has to be completely removed. Otherwise, we're never going to get anywhere at all.
Thank you, Adrian, for a very important point to end this with. We are going to move now to talk about our role and what we need to do as teachers and maybe teacher associations to really put this into effect. So in your views, and some of you are already leaders in teacher associations internationally. So what are the steps, or what is the role of teacher associations? And let's say also teacher support groups for teachers listening to us. What can I do with teachers in my school, in my context, so I can promote the idea of decentering English teaching? Let's talk about practical ideas here, so teachers listening can benefit from this. I'll start with maybe Rosario.
Sure. Well, I would like to say that I believe teacher associations are of vital importance in promoting professional development, in being updated in the latest trends in language teaching, even learning about the decentering approach, for example, in bringing different viewpoints together, and in fostering collaboration among professionals. They facilitate the organization of communities of practice or that share similar needs, and thus may find similar alternatives to the difficulties they are faced with. We can also see a decentering approach when we look at the chances that teacher associations offer teachers to share their work. That could be by presenting at conferences or by publishing papers in their media. So yeah, this panel, for example, I guess that would be an application of the decentering approach, bringing together professionals from different parts of the world. And teacher support groups also facilitate the application of a decentering approach, because when we look for and offer support, we are acknowledging that there are multiple views to one same issue, and finding alternatives and co-creating solutions and action plans foster mutual understanding and development of empathy. And both are essential in language teaching. And at a smaller level, teachers working within one same institution could engage in working together to reach a certain goal, to implement a project, or to support others. And these groups help capitalize on individual strengths and result in more efficient use of resources. They could plan together, they could read students' papers together, they could grade students together, they could plan projects together, and teachers benefits from engaging in exchanges and reflection with peers. And students will profit from improved teaching practice because they will have multiple views. Therefore, there are gains for both students and teachers, and working together as a group within one same institution could be a first step to later join a larger teacher support group, community of practice, or a teacher association. So I guess the teacher associations and teacher support groups play a significant role in applying the decentering approach, and I highly value cooperation and collaboration among professionals.
Thank you, Rosario. Adrian?
Right, I mean, putting it very, very simply, to help their members, especially novice teachers and junior people who are coming into the profession, to gain the confidence to not be seduced by linguistic imperialism, but to find the strength to rely on all the things we've been talking about. And this takes a huge amount of courage, especially when parents who want their children to learn what they think is native speaker English. This is very difficult. And I think, yeah, it's a matter of confidence building and probably trying to take things back to what it was like before the 1970s or the 1960s.
Thank you, Adrian. Yes, Ritabel.
I agree with my two colleagues. They have coined it quite well. I'm in an academic space where we are trying to use the indigenous languages in my country in the academic space as well. And the local English Teachers Association was birthed here at my university, and I'm a member of it. And what we try to do in the association, it's not yet fully there, but those of us who are in academia are trying to do our presentations in both English and the local languages. I noted that when our politicians present on TV, they speak English and one of the indigenous languages, and this sort of attracts people. And so we are trying to transfer that into the classroom, or maybe not necessarily the classroom, but in the schooling kind of sect, not the classroom per se, where the learners would hear an educated person, what they consider to be an educated person, speaking in a local language professionally, not just for correcting purposes. Sit down, keep quiet, no, but presenting formally. And we are gradually trying to get it there. And yeah, I think with time, we may win this battle. Thank you.
Thank you, Ritabel and Rosario and Adrian for sharing your views and experiences with us on the topics that we have raised today. These are just the discussion questions. Of course, the discussion didn't end because you actually give us a lot of thought and things to reflect on from the views that you have shared. I would like to leave time for the questions from the audience, and I'd like to hand it over now to Alan to maybe handle the questions. Alan?
Thanks, Samira. Only one question so far in the chat box. I'm sure there'll be more. This is from Erica Kembe in Cameroon. Well, I think we're a small enough group for people's own voices to be heard. So rather than ventriloquizing Eric's words, Eric, would you like to unmute and ask your question about, I think it's about authority, isn't it? Who has the authority?
Yes, Alan, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm so happy to be part of this event. I thought I was going to miss it completely. And I thank you for putting these experts together and disseminating novel ideas on English language teaching. I'm so excited to be. I happen to have read the works of Adrian, a lot of his works, and I think it's an honor for me to see him here directly. So this is, I think if we have a wider audience, it's going to change mindset as far as English language teaching is concerned. But my worry here is at the level of allow, when we are talking about decentring. My understanding of decentring ELT is to act ontologically in the classroom, that to act on the circumstances and using the available resources in ways that are not dictated by any pedagogic authority. So when we talk about allow, I'm a bit worried whether someone has to allow it to happen. This is my position about it.
Okay, if I may, I probably use the word allowed, and I use it frequently. Maybe what I mean is to give the chance to use, for example, L1 in the classroom, allows L1 in the classroom, because there is a, as my colleagues have said, there is a belief, especially from parents, to think that native speakerism should prevail in teaching, and I at least do not agree with that. I believe more in being or teaching to be intelligible rather than to sound like a native speaker. Okay, so allow for different views to get in would be to use them, incorporate them, okay, in my teaching at least.
Adrian? I think you're muted.
I think, Eric, that's a really important question, because, you know, who is anybody to allow anybody else? However, something that I've increasingly heard from students in the university here, from British students, not particularly to do with language learning, but with all sorts of aspects of education. On a number of occasions, I hear students say, "Am I allowed to do that?" And when I think, where did they get the idea from that they weren't allowed? So when it comes from the students, then you can say, yes, you are.
Retavila, do you want to come in on that? Because I think you may have used the word yourself as well.
Yes, I know I'm guilty as charged. When I was using the word allow, I think I agree with both my colleagues on this. And Eric, yes, you're right. When you talk of power, the power that I had in my mind is the power is in me as an individual. We have a mindset that needs to shift, and it is very difficult to do that. So when we use the word allow, it is to allow ourselves to think differently in this context.
Okay, thank you. Thank you all. Ella, you've got an interesting question here about the tension that might be generated in this situation. Would you like to unmute and put your question?
Well, hello, everyone. I just would like to clarify, because listening to your experience while you were sharing your experiences, I have a feeling that this decentric is a tendency or a trend that is not being accepted, even though in how I understand this idea, it's about, as you mentioned, sharing the position. So I think it should be welcomed at local context. So the question is about this battle, the attitude of battle. If it's a battle, we need to win this, then with whom we are in, I don't know, in confrontation, where the battle happens, in what circles, whom the local teachers or the educators should fight with in order to make this happen. Thank you.
I think I'm the one who who used the word battle. Who, in any society, we've got people who play a leadership role. And when it comes to education, teachers generally play that leadership role. Our way of thinking tends to be influenced by the way we were oriented. So when I was using the word battle, I was referring to the fact that we've got masses of people, the community, the parents, and so on and so forth, who still have a different way of thinking, who need to be helped to see things differently. We have kind of, with education, maybe, I think we have over the years come to change. When I started teaching many years ago, I never wanted any L1 to be used in my classroom. It had to be English and English only. That was my orientation. That's the way I had been taught. And I'm not the only one. And so, but I have now received this new way of thinking, new way of defining life. But I've got masses behind me who have not yet seen that light that I'm, who are not thinking the way I'm thinking, who are not in this space that I'm in right now.
Well, thank you, Rita Bell. Can I ask one follow-up question really briefly, if you don't mind?
Yes, of course.
Because Decentric, idea of Decentric, we started this today conversation about local pedagogies. And do I understand it correctly that Decentric means empowering teachers with some decision-making freedom to decide how to teach English best for their local context, and it's not about integrating L1 or prohibiting L1 in their classroom. That Decentric is about methodology and pedagogy that they would like to apply in their classroom. So that does not come with their materials printed somewhere, but generated right by the teachers on the spot in the field. Is my understanding correct?
Adrian, I think you might like to respond to that.
Well, this is difficult because it's interesting hearing Refabile talk about how there are people who still haven't changed their ideas. We are all, we seem to be in general agreement, supporting a particular way of thinking. So it isn't just a free-for-all where anybody can do whatever they want. And this is where it gets very difficult. So if a particular teacher somewhere wants to use a particular method, which, for example, I would refer to as being very native speakerist, should they be allowed to do it because, this is what they want to do? Well, I think that we have to apply some sort of moral principle, because if in so doing they are misleading their students into believing something which isn't true. But again, you see, how do we decide what's true? So, this is a battle. And, everybody here, I imagine, is on one side. But I'm very aware that there's a certain type of ideology which we're trying to get rid of, but we're adopting another one instead. So it is difficult. But I would say that what helps me